Imagine walking down a busy street and witnessing a chaotic scene. A police officer aggressively confronting a man who looks like he has nowhere to call home. The man, dressed in worn-out clothes and carrying a tattered bag, tries to explain himself, but his words are drowned out by the officer's demands. Onlookers pause, some filming on their phones, while others hurry past, avoiding the unfolding drama. Little do they know, this isn't an ordinary encounter. The man being detained isn't just another face in the crowd. Behind his scruffy appearance lies a shocking truth. He's a self-made millionaire. Yes, you heard that right. Despite his outward look, this man has built a fortune most people could only dream of. But at this moment, none of that seems to matter. All the officer sees is someone who, in their eyes, doesn't belong, and assumptions quickly lead to actions. What happens next? How did this seemingly wealthy individual end up in this position, and what will the officer do once the truth comes out? This story dives deep into the dangers of judging others based on appearance, the biases that shape our society, and the unexpected twists that can turn an ordinary day into a viral moment. Stay tuned as we unravel this incredible tale, revealing not just the events that transpired, but the lessons they carry for all of us. You won't believe how this encounter ends. Trust me, it's one you'll be talking about long after you've watched this. The tension in the air was palpable as the officer tightened his grip on the man's arm, his voice firm and unwavering. "What are you doing here?" he barked, his tone laced with suspicion. The man, visibly shaken but calm, tried to explain. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said softly, his eyes scanning the crowd that had begun to gather. But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears as the officer dismissed them, convinced he had caught someone up to no good. To anyone watching, the scene seemed all too familiar, another example of how appearances can dictate treatment. The man's ragged clothing and unkempt hair painted a picture that made it easy for assumptions to take hold. But what no one could see was the incredible journey that had led him to this moment. A journey marked by triumphs and setbacks, where he had built a life most people only dream of. Today, however, was one of those rare moments where he chose to blend in, to step away from the luxury and wealth that usually surrounded him. As the officer continued to press him, asking for ID and demanding answers, the man hesitated. Should he reveal who he really was? Would it even matter? Or would it only make things worse? The crowd whispered among themselves, some defending the officer's actions, others calling out the unfairness of it all. One voice broke through the chatter. "Do you even know who he is?" The officer, unfazed, dismissed the comment and continued his interrogation. But little did he know that one question was about to unravel everything. What followed would leave the officer, and everyone watching, in utter disbelief. The officer's grip tightened as he repeated his demand, "Show me some ID." Now, the man hesitated, looking down at his hands, his calm demeanor betraying a hint of frustration. "I don't have my wallet with me," he admitted, his voice steady but firm. The officer scoffed, shaking his head. "Convenient," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Meanwhile, a woman in the crowd stepped forward cautiously, her phone still recording. "Officer, I think you're making a mistake," she said. Her voice wavered, but she didn't back down. The officer shot her a sharp glance. "Ma'am, stay out of this," he replied, dismissing her concerns. But the man caught her eye and gave a small nod, as if to say, "It's okay." The crowd began to buzz with murmurs. Some sided with the officer, believing he was just doing his job, while others questioned why he was being so aggressive with someone who didn't appear to be causing harm. "Why does he need ID to walk down the street?" One person whispered. Another chimed in, "He's not hurting anyone. Why not just let him go?" The man, still calm despite the growing tension, spoke again. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of certainty. The officer, now visibly annoyed, scoffed. "Yeah, and who exactly are you?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and the man's silence only deepened the mystery. The woman recording stepped closer, her camera now focused squarely on the man's face. The officer noticed and seemed to falter for a split second, as if realizing the weight of the situation. But before anyone could say another word, someone in the crowd recognized the man. "Wait," they said, their voice rising above the noise. "That's him." All eyes turned to the speaker, and the officer froze. The mystery was unraveling, but the tension was far from over. The crowd fell silent, their curiosity now at its peak. The person who had spoken stepped forward, pointing directly at the man in the officer's grip. "That's him," they repeated, their voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and excitement. The officer, still holding the man tightly, looked between the two, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" he asked sharply, his tone laced with impatience. The man being detained remained quiet, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was thick, and the crowd pressed closer, their phones raised and recording every moment. The woman who had been filming all along gasped, her eyes wide with recognition. "Oh my God," she whispered, the camera trembling slightly in her hands. "It really is him." Confused and on edge, the officer demanded answers. "Who is he? What's going on here?" His voice was louder now, trying to regain control of the situation. But before anyone could respond, the man finally spoke, his voice calm, but cutting through the chaos like a knife. "I tried to tell you," he said, locking eyes with the officer. "But you didn't want to listen." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd as more people began to recognize him. Whispers turned into a low murmur, names being exchanged as the realization spread like wildfire. The officer, still trying to piece it all together, began to falter. "No," he muttered under his breath, his grip loosening slightly. "That's not possible." The man stood a little taller, brushing off the officer's hand as the crowd began to close in. The murmurs grew louder, and someone in the back shouted a name that echoed through the street. The officer's face paled as he finally began to understand who he had been dealing with all along. But before anyone could fully process what was happening, the man took a step forward and said, "Let me make this very clear." The crowd leaned in, their breaths held, waiting for what would come next. Every second felt like an eternity as the story reached its boiling point, leaving everyone desperate to know how this confrontation would end. The man's voice cut through the noise with an authority that silenced the crowd. "You've judged me based on what you see," he said, his tone steady but firm. "But you have no idea who I am, or what I've done." The officer took a cautious step back, his earlier confidence replaced by visible uncertainty. The murmurs from the crowd were growing louder again, and the tension was almost unbearable. But just as the man was about to reveal more, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, dressed sharply, and hurried toward the scene. "Mr. Taylor," the man called out, his voice filled with concern. The crowd gasped collectively, and the whispers turned into an audible buzz. "Wait, Taylor? Is he the Taylor everyone's been talking about?" someone muttered. The officer looked confused, but still tried to maintain control. "Who is this?" he demanded, gesturing toward the man, now referred to as Mr. Taylor. The driver ignored the officer and approached his employer. "We've been looking for you," he said, his tone both worried and relieved. "Your meeting is about to start." The officer's expression shifted again, his grip now fully released. "Meeting?" he repeated, almost to himself. The man, now identified as someone far more significant than anyone initially realized, turned back to face the officer. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried an undeniable weight. "I wanted to take a walk," he said simply, as though the explanation should have been obvious. Before anyone could react, a reporter pushed through the crowd, holding a microphone. "Mr. Taylor," she asked quickly, "is it true you're the founder of Taylor Industries? And why are you out here like this?" The crowd gasped again, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The officer's face turned pale, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. The stakes had shifted dramatically. This wasn't just a wealthy man caught in a misunderstanding. This was someone with power, influence, and now, the attention of everyone around them. But just as it seemed the story might take a clear direction, the man smiled faintly and said, "There's more to this than you think." The crowd froze, hanging on his every word, unsure of what was coming next. It wasn't over yet, and the real twist was still to come. The crowd stood in stunned silence, their attention glued to the man who had just been revealed as a powerful millionaire. The officer, now visibly shaken, stammered as he tried to regain his composure. I didn't know," he muttered, his earlier confidence completely gone. The man, Mr. Taylor, looked at him calmly, his expression unreadable. "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Mr. Taylor said firmly, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. He took a step closer, his calm demeanor somehow more commanding than any outburst could have been. "You looked at me, made your assumptions, and acted on them. That's the problem." The officer's head hung slightly, but before anyone could fully process the weight of Mr. Taylor's words, he turned back to the crowd. "I didn't dress this way by accident," he said, his voice carrying above the murmurs. "I wanted to see how people would treat me if I didn't look like the man you all know from the headlines. And now I have my answer." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, and the officer looked up, realizing this was bigger than just him. Mr. Taylor continued, his tone unwavering. "This wasn't just about me. It's about how quick we are to judge people based on appearances, how easily we make decisions without understanding someone's story." But just as it seemed the lesson had landed, Mr. Taylor surprised everyone again. He turned to the officer, extended his hand, and said, "I don't want an apology. I want you to do better, and I'll help you." The officer looked stunned, unsure of how to respond. The crowd watched in awe as Mr. Taylor added, "We all have biases, but it's what we do to overcome them that matters." The officer hesitated, then slowly shook Mr. Taylor's hand, a mix of guilt and gratitude crossing his face. The crowd erupted into applause, but Mr. Taylor wasn't done. He turned back to his driver, who handed him a thick envelope. "This is for the community," he said, addressing the crowd. "Let's start fixing the real problems." The officer stepped back as Mr. Taylor walked toward the car, but just before he got in, he turned and said one last thing. "Remember, you never know who someone is, or what they've been through, just by looking at them." The car door closed, and as it pulled away, the crowd was left reflecting on what they had just witnessed. It was a moment no one would forget, with lessons that went far deeper than anyone had expected. As the sleek car disappeared down the street, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Some spoke about the officer's actions, others marveled at Mr. Taylor's humility, and a few reflected on their own assumptions. The woman who had been filming stopped her recording, lowering her phone and shaking her head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like that," she muttered to herself, her voice tinged with awe. The officer stood off to the side, staring at the ground as if lost in thought. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by something more vulnerable, perhaps regret, or maybe determination to change. He took a deep breath and looked around at the remaining bystanders. "I need to do better," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. A man nearby nodded, offering a small, encouraging smile before walking away. For those who had stayed to watch the encounter unfold, the moment left a lasting impact. Mr. Taylor's words lingered in their minds, challenging them to see people differently, to take a moment to listen before passing judgment. It wasn't just about wealth or appearances. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their circumstances. Later that evening, the video recorded by the woman began to circulate online. It quickly went viral, sparking heated debates and important conversations about prejudice, respect, and accountability. Many praised Mr. Taylor's grace under pressure and his willingness to use the situation as a teaching moment. As the world watched, one thing became clear. The story wasn't just about a wealthy man in disguise or a misguided officer. It was a mirror held up to society, reminding everyone to look beyond the surface and treat each other with dignity. And that lesson, above all, was the true ending to this story.